Welcome to the Organic Filaments Network. This is Sher Ali Khan. My guest today is Dr. Ather Zia, a political anthropologist, a poet, a Kashmiri who teaches in Colorado, and founded the journal Kashmir Lit and co-founded the Critical Kashmir Studies Collective. In 2019, she wrote Resisting Disappearance about the mothers who have spent decades looking for their sons who never came home. In 2025, she published a book of poems, In Kashmir, Writing Under Occupation. And her recent work is about what happens when a state decides that mourning is a crime. This is not a figure of speech. In Kashmir today, the dead are buried in guarded graveyards far from home. Funerals are banned, and families have been charged under anti-terror laws for grieving. The state does this while projecting an image of total stability. They showcase manicured tulip gardens, circulate cinematic drone footage of the landscape, hold government-run elections, and maintain a constant narrative that the region has finally returned to normalcy. One question that runs through everything Ather writes is, who is allowed to remember? Welcome to the show, Ather. How are you doing?
Thank you so much. I'm doing well. It's a great honor to be here and to be talking to you about Kashmir and my work.
Yeah, I want to begin with the artist statement and a little bit of a background around In Kashmir. You write that poetry spurts at the frontier where the gaze of stark prose is constricted by barbed wire, and that poetry does not merely archive, it makes one a witness. You had already written the prose Resisting Disappearance. It's 400 pages. What could poems say that the ethnography could not?
Thank you so much for this question. So, I think the ethnography is people's voices that I rendered, and I wanted to stay true to what they were saying on ground. And that's what ethnography is. It's deep listening. Even though anthropology does have colonial roots, and we have to pay attention to that as well. But in the current moment, the kind of decolonial ethnography or decolonial anthropology that we try to practice, that kind of rendered the voices of these activists, women, mothers, families, and in this network of people, what was emerging through them about the disappearances, the enforced disappearances of more than 10,000 men, who are mostly Kashmiri men. There are children as well, and that is documented too. So there is the grounded ethnography, which is staying very true to what you find on ground and true within the purview of academia as well, even though it is written in a very accessible ethnographic format, which is a form of storytelling. That's what it is. It's the stories of people that have not been seen as genuine stakeholders. So resisting disappearance essentially is a grounded ethnography. It is the voices of people. It is the voices of these activists, these mothers who started the Association of Parents of Disappeared Persons. It was Parveena Ahangar who co-founded it in 1994 with Pervez Imroz, who is a human rights lawyer and a human rights activist. They co-founded it, and they also won a couple of awards together. And in that idiom, the work that I was doing, this was wholly and solely trying to stay grounded within the voices and narratives of these activists. And many of them are mothers. Many of them are what you call as half widows, meaning the husbands have disappeared and they don't know whether they're dead or alive. This was a term that was given to them by the local English media, and that's how they have been known in the last 35 plus years. So these are 10,000 disappearances. So it was a huge responsibility to talk about not just the human rights issue, but what does this human rights violation say about what Kashmiris are living under? Because that also questions the very fabric of what you call the democracy that India is. So it questions that. It also takes you way back into history. Like, what exactly is Kashmir and why is there so much dissent and why is there so much resistance, whether that be discursive resistance or whether that be the armed resistance. So that's the grounded ethnography part. But then And it does the work of listening, and it also does the work of rendering that listening as much as possible and as authentically as possible. That's humanly possible. So, but also being a poet, there was this other side to my work where I was rendering most of the things as an ethnographer who was trying to stay very boxed within what academia gives you a leeway for, and trying to do the work of grounded ethnography. But at the same time, I did want, because I'm a poet, or I like to, I think I'm a poet. So I also rendered it simultaneously into poetry, because I think as a Kashmiri, it was also a space for me to what I called, this was like there was this surfeit of emotion and affect that was happening when you do this kind of work, when you are with the families, because you do participant observation, it's a 10-year project that culminated in 2019, and it started in 2007, 2008. So it was a 10-year long journey with the APDP, with Parveena Ahangar, with other activists and mothers and families and people who are associated with APDP and people who are not associated with APDP but have had disappearances in their families, have had different kinds of human rights violations. So there's a plethora of human rights violations that have happened in the last 70 plus years, and which had been stepped up after 1989. So enforced disappearance is just one of them. But it was also very unique for the society, because suddenly people are disappearing. That was the 90s. Someone would leave in the morning and not return. So it also became this open wound, and the society did not really know what to do with it. Whether do you do a funeral for the disappeared, or do you just wait for them? And that's the work of mourning. Slowly and steadily it culminated in this movement, and also it culminated in a politics of mourning, because you could not do active politics inside Kashmir. You cannot be an active dissident. You don't have freedom of expression. So APDP was very unique in creating this politics of mourning, and mourning like regular protests where they would monthly or twice monthly, whenever, commemorating various days, they would sit in a public plaza, and that's where they would have this protest, which also looked like a funeral, and where there would be traditional funeral songs that the women would sing. And it wasn't a free protest. They were surveilled heavily, and there was a lot of humiliation and beatings and imprisonment around that, which is a separate story. So all of that was happening, and this was a 10-year long engagement with this movement, which sadly right now is under deep surveillance, and they cannot protest anymore. And the poetry was the other side of it. I think poetry was my personal space of catharsis, but then it also gave expression to things that I wanted to make connections with within the politics as well. And that's what you see in Kashmir, writing under occupation. It's also there's like a little bit of a personal journey, but it's also about all the symbolics of occupation that Kashmir presents and represents to its people, but also to the outside world. And that's what In Kashmir is, the poetry book.
Really appreciate that, because in the same statement, you write that the killable body of Kashmiris is afflicted with an active forgetting in order to survive. And the poems seem to work against that. A day in the life that inches prayer by prayer. That's on page 32 to 34 from In Kashmir. It measures out one ordinary day in 5 prayers, and no one is killed in it. What is the labor of that forgetting, and is the poem a way of refusing it?
I think my entire work is a refusal to forget what Kashmiris have gone through historically and what they're going through in this moment. And that poem represents a day in a life of a Kashmiri. And because many of them are Muslims, and what has been happening in the last 70 plus years under the Indian occupation, most of Kashmiri life is so heavily surveilled. And there are different kinds of human rights violations that occur, but I would say the most profound and deeply felt is the humiliation that happens on Kashmiri streets every day. When Kashmiris, being from the homeland, being from that soil, being from that earth, are not allowed to freely move without their identity cards, without being stopped, without being asked where they're going, without them having to prove loyalty, whatever that means. So that poem is a reflection of that. It is again, it's a refusal to forget, because there is an imposed forgetting. Some censorship is also a form of forgetting. It's asking people to not write. It's asking people to edit out what they would have wanted to record for posterity. So that is happening in this moment. We know that censorship has always been part and parcel of Kashmiri life. There's never been a time when Kashmiris have been able to express freely in different measures, I want to say. There was a time from in the 2000s when a lot of intellectual and lot of creative output was being delivered by Kashmiris and offered to their own society and outside as well. It was called the Kashmiri Intifada because there were films, there were poetry, there was graffiti, there was different kinds of, you know, poet novels that have been written and that are quite famous and reputed. But now, and slowly and steadily, what has been happening is that the censorship has gotten so deep that in 2022, there was a law that was passed. It's actually called a media gag. And according to that, there's so much surveillance of what can be reported from on ground, unless and until it doesn't put India in a positive light, the any kind of coverage doesn't get a green signal. And journalists are de-empaneled, their media portals, their newspapers, they are demonetized, and different kinds of penalizations are done. And to top it all, journalists are also incarcerated. They're also labeled as terrorists and then thrown into jail. Obviously, they're not, nothing is proven later on, and many of them have been released, but many of them are still in jails. And that happens to human rights activists as well. There is hardly any documentation of human rights violations happening in the last 5-6 years because human rights defenders are also in jails. And when you think about the movement that I was working with, the Association of Parents of Disappeared Persons, they have been raided. They have been there are two APDPs, and Khurram Parvez, who heads one, he's in jail since the last 4 years. And the other APDP, which is headed by Parveena Ahangar, the activist mother, she is under surveillance and she has been raided, and these offices are de facto closed. So that is the moment that we are living in, witnessing Kashmir, so to speak. So I think there is this movement to make everything kind of silent inside Kashmir by the Indian government. And this is a silencing that I don't think Kashmiris are silent, so to speak. They have been silenced. It's the silence of a graveyard, as one of the Kashmiris very recently in one of the interviews they put it. And I do think it's not the absence of dissent as much as it is the repression of whatever form of expression people can have, as little as an emoticon, as little as a social media post that alludes to something that the Indian government has done. So every kind of dissent, be that big or small, every kind of freedom of expression that shows Kashmiri political history in its correct form, that shows political desire of Kashmiris, is all of that is in under repression at the moment, and the freedom of expression is de facto gone.
I just wanted to add that your Global Voices piece on Khurram Parvez, you spell out how SPA has worked and the prosecution, the way it's occurred, in terms of government sanction. And then in over 30 years, not one member of the Indian forces has been tried in a civilian court. In 2023, a tribunal suspended the life sentence of a captain convicted over a staged killing. When you write lawfare, what exactly is the law doing in this situation?
So when we think about law in Kashmir, it's not been the mode of ideal law, it as much as it has been to impose some form of order and some form of capitulation from people. And by lawfare, just like the regular definition that it is, I do mean when law is deployed as a weapon against people to repress them. And that's what we see in Kashmir. So the Armed Forces Special Powers Act that was enacted and implemented somewhere in the 1990s, I think 1991, right after the armed struggle, that gives the army a free reign in the region. It's technically a military rule. So they are the ones who are deciding Well, and in this moment, what you think about when you think about Kashmir after 2019, any area can be considered as a strategic area, and people can be thrown out of that place. And that has happened in a couple of places. And that has also right now, if you think about how much land is under the army and other forces, it's the size of Dallas. And Kashmir is not that big a place. So when we look at Kashmir in this moment, there are laws, and I always like to give this analogy of a bird cage. Like when you look at a Kashmiri or a Kashmiri life, it's inside a bird cage, and they're the bars. They represent each mode of penalization that happens and is imposed upon people. So lawfare is one of them. Bureaucracy is another, because there are laws that are passed. There is the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. There is the Disturbed Areas Act. Then there is the UAPA, which is also prevalent in the most penalizing form on Kashmiris. You can see that many of the Kashmiris, once they go through the rigors of being imprisoned for years on end, they usually acquitted. But there is more than, I think, more than 75%. I am not exactly sure of the statistics, but many of the people, I think it's more than 90% of people are acquitted, but that it takes years of their life. So it's almost like the process is the punishment itself. Then, so lawfare. Then there you have bureaucracy. You very recently also saw when the Dominion law was changed after the removal of autonomy in 2019. And removal of autonomy was a huge rupture in a way that now the New Delhi could directly govern the region, which has not happened for the first time, by the way. But the region was demoted from state to a union territory. The autonomy was removed militarily, unilaterally, without asking people. And Kashmiris used to be permanent residents of Kashmir, which meant that they had a special status as permanent residents. Their rights, their indigenous rights were protected. They had right to franchise, right to property. But soon after, what happens is that there are no more permanent residents. And that because of the removal of autonomy, now it's been added to India as one of its states. Not even a state. It's been demoted to a union territory to be ruled by a nominated official from the current government that is in power in New Delhi. So what that also does is there's a deep humiliation that has happened and a deep demotion of Kashmiris culturally, intellectually, and slowly and steadily we are at a moment when no one can talk freely. If the Indian government likes to talk about, when the Indian government talks about normalization, I think, and also the streets being quiet and people being quiet, I think we need to question, like, how is it possible that the streets can be so quiet, people can be so quiet that there's not even a whisper of dissent. How does this democracy exist? Because I think dissent is the juice of any democracy. And that's not what's prevalent inside Kashmir right now. It's out and out repression. It's a military occupation. And after 2019, it's brazenly settler colonial. That is not to say it was not colonial before, but settler colonialism has its modes and it kind of like transforms and shapes. And I think we are in the moment where people are actively being dispossessed, and even from the land that they live on.
In Resisting Disappearance, you read Afzal Guru's hanging in the Court's own words to satisfy the collective conscience of the nation. He was killed by the law, not outside of it. And since 2019, we've seen like the state hold elections and restored statehood be part of the conversation. What is democracy doing when it needs a killable Kashmiri in the Indian context?
So the answer to this question is like twofold. One is that it forces us to think about nation state system itself, which was imposed on most of the world after in 1940s, and it was in the idiom and template of Westphalian nation states, and we kind of are following a settler nation state system in India. When you look at Kashmir through that lens, if we think about America being a democracy, but it is on the foundational violence of a settler state that it has been, and slowly and steadily it kind of like is seen also as progressive because of the different things that it did, like it abolished slavery and then civil rights and all of that, that it has become progressive over time. But the foundation is settler colonial. And this is the template of nation state systems. And I'm not making it black and white. There are different forms that have been implemented all across the world, but the basis of this nation state system is very violent. So one is that we have to think about that in a parallel manner. And the other is that India proposes and propagates that it's a democracy. And we do want to ask the question, like, how is it possible that a democracy can hang a person without due process? And that is not just Afzal Guru. That has also happened to Maqbul Bhatt. What exactly happened in Afzal Guru's case was that he was a militant and then he surrendered. He did not want to continue with militancy anymore. But he was already marked because he was also picked up by the counter-insurgency grid, and then they kind of deployed and weaponized him in different ways, and he ends up being convicted, not convicted, he ends up being accused of this attack that happened on the Indian parliament. And it took, I think, a decade. In that decade, he was painted as this oppressive Muslim terrorist. And I think initially when he was caught, and I've written about this, when he was arrested, he was wearing just a Western style trousers and shirt, and he did not have a beard. But I think being incarcerated, he probably, because being incarcerated and being under such pressures, he had started wearing kurta pajama, which is the tunic, long tunic and trousers, and then he would also wear a shawl or a scarf around his head, and he kept a beard. And that was the picture that was circulated during that one decade with the news around. It was a media trial that happened right from the get-go. And in the morning of February 9th, when he was hanged, his family doesn't know. They had actually petitioned for amnesty and they were still waiting for that. His personal effects were not sent to them. And when he was hanged as per the Supreme Court judgment, said that it was to assuage or for the collective conscience of Indian nation, because it was basically baying for blood. And Kashmiri body has become killable. It brings the Indian nation state together, because it's a body that is kind of seen doubly outcast. It's not just Muslim, but it's also Kashmiri. And Kashmiris, you only have to look at a few Bollywood pictures to think about movies. You have to see what they think of Kashmiris. And this is not just in the last 30 years. You can go back to even early 90s with this film called Roja, which is cinematically seen as a masterpiece, but it demonizes Kashmiris. And even if you go back to the 60s, it's not as if they have been kind. It's almost like through this colonial gaze where they see Kashmiris as servile people who only have to pander to tourists. And, it's in that idiom that Kashmiris have been seen right from the get-go. And in this moment, the demonization is complete. And I know that now in the whole subcontinent, and when we have kind of seen what's been happening in the last 10, 15 years within India, the demonization of Muslims at large, and that kind of makes Kashmiris as doubly outcasts.
I want to shift to the mothers, which are a prominent figure in your book, Resisting Disappearance. The half-widow is made not by a death, but by the withholding of one, neither wife nor widow, unable to inherit or remarry. In the poems, the same waiting turns domestic, and the ex-fighter returns. A woman keeps a lunch warm for a man who's already dead. Why is not telling her such an effective instrument of rule?
I don't think there is a not telling in there. I don't know like how that came across.
I was looking at the figure of the half widow, right, from
Yeah.
Resisting Disappearance,
No, but
and trying to
the
connect it to.
ex-militant returns is a different poem. That's not about a disappearance. It's about a killing, and that is this woman basically kind of like trying to render an experience of a woman whose husband was an ex-militant. And there have been people like that who I met and who did those things. And she is basically waiting for him. And then this deluge is kind of coming to her home. So I don't think there is anything that's keeping her from knowing that. But it's almost like she is in her mind, in a Kashmiri woman's mind, even now, when people think that the direct violence and aggression has gone down, there's always this fear that someone is going to be killed once they leave home, because that's what it is to live under militarization. If the
Mhm.
government, if the Indian government is propagating the idea of normalcy, why is it that there's
Mhm.
so much military inside the region? Why is it that there's so many bunkers? Why is it that the ratio, it keeps changing because we don't have the current statistics of how many soldiers are in the region, but we know somewhere in the neighborhood of 700,000, which we have more or less seen in the last 3 decades. And the ratio of the people Kashmiri to soldier is 1 to 17, or sometimes 1 to 10, as it's kind of like, exists in different records. So if there is normalcy, why do we even have these people around? And, so for a Kashmiri to leave their home is an act of extreme courage, because the moment they leave their home, and I'm not saying that home is safe, but still it's a sacred private space which has been desecrated anyways, because the soldiers can come anytime, and they have, and they do. But the moment you step outside, you know that everything is under assault, from your body to your dignity, and everything that comes in between. And that poem kind of talks about this ex-militant, because that was also part of Kashmiri life, where there used to be people who were part of the militancy and then they gave it up. And Afzal Guru was one of them as well.
And in your work, those you call what those women do affective law, mourning that becomes a kind of law where the courts deliver none.
Mhm.
Is that law standing against the states, or is it what fills the space the courts left empty? And I guess what I'm trying to get at is, what is the concept, and can you tell a little bit about
Mhm.
that?
So one of the things that we've been doing in Critical Kashmir Studies, and I think as scholars who come from these places which are really extremely have been contested, and there's so much violence, and also thinking through the lens of decolonial feminism. We think about law as being just the state law, and that's what needs to be followed, because the sovereign's law is absolute and you have to follow it. And if you do not follow it, you are a deviant, you're a traitor, you're an anti-national. And I think that's what the nation state system teaches us. It teaches us that sovereignty rests with the state, and then you have to live within that. And if you don't follow the rules, you're not a good person lawfully, and also even morally, because we kind of like equate the two. So what I noticed when I was working with the women, the activists of the APDP, the mothers, the wives, and there is one of the life stories of this very active senior APDP activist, and a very spiritual, deeply spiritual woman who had lost her son. And I noticed that she kept her door open even in the harshest of winters. She wanted to keep it a little open, always. And then she kind of told me these stories. And I noticed that most of these people, most of these families, they had this strange connection with the doors. And I'm not saying that was unique. That's also cultural, because people do say something like, oh, I don't want to keep my door closed. So it's kind of like to show that there is an openness for guests, for people who might need shelter and things like that. So going back to the mother, Husna, that's her name in the book, and it's changed because we had to anonymize some of them. What she would do was she would say that, she doesn't fear keeping the door open. And there is a context to that, what she means by that. Because in Kashmir, you have soldiers everywhere. And it's not soldiers for security as much as it is soldiers against your security, because they see Kashmiris as suspect. So there are curfews when you can't keep your door open. You have all sorts of people connected to not just to the government forces who are also informers. So you don't keep your door open. You tend to be, you want to keep yourself safe. So she would say that she doesn't fear anyone. She doesn't fear if a mouse comes in or if a soldier comes in, because she was waiting for her son, and this sense of waiting has become so deep in the lives of people whose kin has disappeared, mostly sons, mostly husbands and fathers. So they have this deep connection with doors, keeping the door open, or there's some kind of narrative around the door. So slowly and steadily I realized that there was these different things that they did that kind of restored their sovereignty. And I'm not glamorizing the grief. I'm not glamorizing the tragedy. What I'm trying to do is I was trying to restore the humanity in doing the things that are so deeply agentive in face of this huge, these laws that kind of make everything that they do risky and dangerous. Like the protests that they do, that's very risky and dangerous. They can be killed and no one is going to be accountable for it. They can be disappeared, no one is going to be accountable for it. So she would say that I keep my door open, I don't fear, because so slowly and steadily I began to see how they have reorganized their internal lives, their daily life, and this everyday resistance that I began to see even in the choice of home she had chosen for herself, which was very close to her spiritual mentor, long past, a saint's shrine where she had chosen to rent her rooms. So that's what I began to see as affective law, that the law with which they kind of negotiate their everyday life and gain their agency from one thing to another. And most of that is, most of the things that they are fighting are are kind of like always, they're against this huge behemoth of a machinery that is also manifested in a judiciary that is not helping them. The laws, nothing helps them because what they get. So this mother, she was also fighting a case in the court to retrieve her son, but all she was getting was rescheduling of the cases, and from everywhere. She's trying everything to find her son. She's approaching bureaucrats, she's approaching the courts, she's doing her activism, she's also doing spiritual activism, so to speak, because she has rented these rooms very close to the shrine where she goes almost 5 times a day to pray for her son's return. And so in that order, when you kind of see their lives, you see with deep ethnographic vigor, you realize that they're restoring some order. They're restoring, and they also have this, what I called, there is the sovereign's law, which is basically doing all this human rights violation of enforced disappearances with impunity, but at the same time, they have their own affective laws that they have devised to move from day to day, to do their activism, to lead their daily life and not to capitulate. And that also is manifest in this thing that she said, which I really find very profound. And I think that's the pivot around which human agency is predicated. She says that I don't really fear a mouse or a soldier. I keep my door open because she is in waiting and she's refused the forgetting that is imposed by the state.
I want to return to that figure of the good half widow. And in Resisting Disappearances, you also mentioned that she's a figure that has to grieve correctly. But you're also on a different level, you document how mothers gather around for various forms of protest. Can she refuse that role and still be heard? Is my question in relation to a half widow.
I think I also talk about the half widow, just for those who don't know, are women whose husbands have disappeared. And as I said earlier, it was a term given to them by the journalists who are writing in English and English dailies in the region. So these women, most of them are now in their early 50s, late 50s. When I was working with them, many of them were in their mid 30s and I have worked with them even before I was an anthropologist. So I have been associated with the APDP in different capacities, even informally, from before 2008. So I knew of the group. It was a heartbreak for all Kashmiris to kind of witness them going through so much, the rigors that they had to go through. So the women who are half widows, what I tried to say in that explanation was that many of them are young women, many of them are quite beautiful. How do women who are still young, how do they mourn in a society which is not, and I don't want to paint Kashmir as a place which doesn't allow women to publicly, manifest in professions, in education. It's a place which has its own form of progressiveness where women, and we also have to look at this movement, and when what I am writing about, we have to kind of also see this till 2019, 2020, because in the last 6, 7 years, the firmament in Kashmir has quite changed. And also because APDP protest is not allowed anymore. And there's no protest, there is no dissent that you can show anymore. There is nothing that you can do except what the government allows. So we have to take ourselves to that moment in time when we are thinking about these women. So I noticed that there was a difference in how the half widows did their protest and how the mothers did their protest. And so I kind of like was speaking to this idea of, society's internal misogyny and patriarchy, and also the status of mothers and the status of wives. So there is that interplay happening. But overall, all of them were taking equal role in the protest. It's just how they would publicly present themselves that I kind of like speak to, where the younger women, they would kind of like be in the backdrop and the mothers would kind of lead the stage. But we also have to see the element of protection there. It's not that they're hiding them all the time. It's also that mothers are seen as these protectors. And these are younger women who have younger children. They're also taking care of their toddlers because, remember the half widows are, some are in their early 20s, some are in their mid 30s, some are in their early 40s. So they still have younger children. So the older women are doing the leading, which is not to say that younger women are not leaders at that time. They are. In fact, one of the APDPs where Khurram Pervez is the one of the coordinators, they have a younger woman who leads the movement. And again, right now the movements are both de facto banned, so we can't really talk about what is happening in this moment, but whatever I'm speaking of is before 2020. So that's what I was speaking to. But I also like to think about Kashmir as which I note in the book, that it's a working class patriarchy, no doubt, but women have always been in the mainstream. And I also want to draw the listeners' attention to thinking about how women have existed in such societies. They have always worked in Kashmir. So there is a classist element to hiding women from public gaze. It's only the women who can afford to do that. And usually those women are from higher classes, because the classes that are financially disadvantaged, the working classes, the women from those working classes have already worked for millennia, for centuries. And in Kashmir, if the men catch the fish, it's the women who sell it. If men bake the bread, it's the women who sell it. If it's the men who grow vegetables, it's the women who sell it. So you kind of see that women have worked for the longest possible time. That's what I kind of call it, as a working class patriarchy. And then after 1940s, we have women in mainstream, and women are, I don't have the current statistics, but it's more than 42% women are educated and they are in different fields. So I'm not trying to kind of defend that Kashmir is a progressive society on the pivot of thinking through the lens of women, which is what liberal feminism teaches us to use as one of the benchmarks. But what I'm trying to say is that in Kashmir, women were not hidden, so to speak. They have always been part of the mainstream. They've always been working. And what that explanation in Resisting Disappearance was doing, it was trying to draw attention to how we treat younger activists and how they manifest, and how we treat the older activists and how they manifest, and what's the role of this ideal and symbolic of motherhood through which this activism is mostly done, and also the wife.
I really appreciate that. And I want to get into your new article in Critical Sociology, Enforced Disappearance in Death and Criminalization of Grief in Kashmir. And you introduce this term, incarcerated burials, to describe how the state now seizes the dead. Can you give a little bit of insight into that, and how that plays out, and what you're trying to point to?
Yeah, in the last 1 decade. So, what used to happen in Kashmir was, if there was a militant funeral, when militants, which there are still a lot of skirmishes that happen between militants and Indian army and other government forces, where the militants are killed. and sometimes they are bombed within the hideouts that they are in. So, and the houses are razed down, and there's a lot of that going on still in the remote regions. And I think every now and then we hear about such skirmishes, even though such reporting doesn't come to light anymore because reporters can't really report from on ground. That has also been classified. So, going back to and the governments, various governments, I'm not just saying that this direct rule from New Delhi in this moment, but various governments have tried to fine tune a certain ban on the militant funerals because they used to be a place where people would come together. It was a very impromptu funeral procession that would turn into a demonstration, and then people would inter the body with different kinds of, traditions that had been developed around. Obviously, like they were founded on Islamic symbolisms and Islamic practices, but people would join them, and then people from far off villages and, cities, they would travel sometimes on foot. In 2016, we saw one of the biggest funerals of this young 21-year-old commander named Burhan Wani, and it was like a massive funeral that happened over a period of number of days, and there were a number of funeral prayers that were offered. So ever since then, 2016 to 2020, you could kind of see there was this heightening of discussion about banning funerals because the government was seeing it as radicalizing youth, because these also become symbolics of memory, symbolics of, talking about martyrdom of these young boys and men. And in the last, I think more than a decade, many of them have been native Kashmiris from the Indian administered Kashmir. So there was this discussion around criminalizing, not banning the funerals. But in 2020, it kind of came to fruition because you had COVID happening. And by then, the little administrative orders that were in place that the funeral should happen on only with the family, that kind of was firmly put in place because after 2020, during COVID, you would not allow a lot of people, even for a regular civilian funeral. You wouldn't, if someone died, you just had a couple of people for the burial because people were social distancing, and many of the areas were cut off from each other because of, again, different kinds of, there were in Kashmir, what I heard also was that there were barricades that were put in between two different towns to kind of impose the social distancing format, but in neighborhoods. So it's during that time that this comes full circle, that now you have a proper ban on funerals. And that's one, and it's not new that these graveyards popped up in these remote regions, but it's then that this was firmed up as a policy that now if a militant was killed, even if the militant was from a locality, there are many unidentified bodies, but then there is also people who are identified, and many of them have been people who have been killed they have been alleged as militants, and they have just been killed. These are extrajudicial killings that have happened, even of young boys as young as 17, and then they are taken and then they're interned in this place where you have complete surveillance and to reach those places. And ironically, they're also in places which are seen as these scenic resorts. So on one side, these are scenic resorts, but on the other side, they have these graveyards, which are heavily surveilled. And to reach them, you have to get a permission. So which means that if the body of a militant who's a known militant from Kashmir, they have a family, or if they're not militants and they have been killed with an extrajudicial, through extrajudicial means, or some killings are also custodial killings, they also take the body and they try to inter it. And then the family intervenes and the family wants to get the body back. There is a famous case of a young boy, I think his name is Ather, and his dad has been fighting for his body for the longest possible time. So you have these heartbreaking stories where families have kept graves waiting for their sons who they know were not militants, or those that are militants. But this criminalization of grief, which is, it is very insidious. It doesn't just humiliate the dead, but it also humiliates those who are alive, because the whole graveyard is kind of a jail now, and that's where the bodies are. So it's not that you are jailed when you're alive, you're also jailed when you're dead. So the other thing that we should talk about is that Afzal Guru, who we talked about earlier, who was hanged by the Indian government in 2013, and also Maqbul Bhatt, who was hanged in 1984. Again, these are Kashmiri killable bodies on which the nation state feasts and comes together as a nation. So you see those both of them are interned in Tihar jail. They haven't been, the bodies haven't been given back to their families. So they have they have two graves waiting in Srinagar's Martyrs graveyard, which is the largest graveyards where most of the people who were killed either as militants or who were non-combatants, but were again killed, they have been buried there. Again, that is not a place where people can go freely anymore, because it's seen as a marked place, because everything is so surveilled heavily that if you go there, if you are family or not, the police is going to ask you questions. So there is, there is a tail on you all the time. And then we can also think about criminalization of grief through the lens of Sayyid Ali Gilani, who was one of the leaders of Kashmiri resistance. And I don't want to go into the politics of it, but I just want to say that he was one of the most well-known faces, and he died, I think he was in his 90s, and he was under house arrest for a long time. And he died of old age ailments. I think he also had a terminal disease. And finally, in 2021 September, he passed away, and his family, there was a curfew after he passed away. So no one, not even journalists, were allowed to go near his house or cover it. And they did not allow the family to take the body to the Martyrs graveyard, where most of the freedom fighters are. And he was buried in the night with only a couple of family present, and in a graveyard where they don't even have a name, they don't even have an epitaph. And now his gravesite is under surveillance 24/7, so people can't even visit it. So there is this deep criminalization of grief and mourning, because that was one place where Kashmiris could congregate and traditionally, and even in the new idiom, try to narrativize what's happening to them. It was not only a site of quote unquote radicalization, but these were sites of memorializations. These were sites that were keeping alive the political history. And in this moment, what the Indian government would like to tell the world is that the Kashmiri streets are quiet, normalcy has been restored, but it is silence of a graveyard.
That's very fascinating, and I wonder how you look at the criminalization of grief in relation to the affective law that you speak about in resisting disappearances. Do you see it as a counter to that, or is this something else?
So what I like to see this as, in the last 30 years, despite all odds, despite the deep militarization, deep repression, despite the different human rights violations and different forms of persecution in every decade, like in the 90s, it was the disappearances and extrajudicial killings. And at the 2000s, it was the pellet shotguns that were blinding people. And Kashmir has world's first mass blinding, so to speak. We have more than 2,500 people who have been blinded or partially blinded. So within that, even through that, you kind of saw that Kashmiris came together slowly and steadily to tell their story. And the journalists, the Kashmiri journalists, with all the limitations, they were part and parcel of that. They were rendering these stories from on ground for the world in the international media. There were novelists, there were scholars who came together to revisit, because Kashmiris had never told their own stories. They have been occupied for 100 of years now, more than 500, and they have lived under various occupations. This is a very modern form of occupation that Kashmiris are living under. So the stories that were told to them, if you think about the classic colonialism, it told them that you are cowards, that you are not fighters, that you are liars, that you are lazy. The classic colonial idiom. And Kashmiris more or less had internalized that. And I do mention that in the book. And then after 1940s, they were told by India, and also like the nations, and big nation states are contesting, they're telling Kashmiris that one, you're not genuine stakeholders. And second, that Pakistan is treating you as proxy, as if Kashmiris don't have their own political will. Kashmir is a civilizational entity. That's what we have to understand. But the fact is that their story had been taken away from them. But in the last 30 to 40 years, I want to say that in the last 70 years, Kashmiris have written, they have critically thought, but it was also repressed in some ways. So that's why I say that censorship has always been part and parcel of Kashmiri life. But in the last 30 years, people have traveled out, people tried to get the story, piece the story together. Like, who are they as political people? They always had very strong political subjectivity, but the story was not, the story was taken away. It was either said by India, it was either said by Pakistan, it was either said by global filmmakers and documentary filmmakers and global researchers. So the Kashmiris, the vantage of Kashmiris and the story that they needed to get out was repressed. So in the last 30 to 40 years, that has kind of gone away because of more and more literacy, because of media, because people traveling out of Kashmir. So now there is this critical understanding of Kashmir that comes from Kashmiris through art, through novel, through academia, through various forms of various genres. So I think that presents a threat to the state, because now you have a narrative, you have people speaking about themselves, and that doesn't just come through writing. That also comes through what people have done through different forms of resistance, whether that be armed or unarmed, that be even when you look at the APDP format, and the protests that they did, the politics of mourning, and that is affective law. And I think everything is built on affective law, because the government is not patronizing you to produce these narratives and this Kashmiri story that people got right in the last 70 years, slowly and steadily and incrementally. And I think it reached a moment where the world was paying attention, and the Kashmiri story was recognized that this is a problem, a genuine problem. It's not terrorism, it's not proxy war. Obviously, like, it can be seen through various lenses, but when you look at it from the vantage of Kashmiris, it is a genuine problem. For all its limitations, I'm using United Nations in this particular explanation as an icon of sort of like what the world understands as genuine. So Kashmiris would invoke United Nations and say, hey, we are on the agenda of United Nations alongside Palestine right from 1947, to kind of invoke the genuineness of their struggle. So I think they got that right, and as the genuineness of Kashmiri struggle is being seen incrementally in the last 70 years, slowly and steadily. And I think the criminalization of grief and the criminalization of mourning is extremely necessary for the state, because it does show how much consensus people have on the struggle. And the struggle inside Kashmir is called Tehreek, which means movement. It's not called terrorism. So all of those things Kashmiris have tried to explain through variety of ways and variety of genres. And I think the extreme repression should be read as a reflection of the story that Kashmiris have in this moment in their own hands, which they can narrativize and tell the world. But the saddest thing is that the world is very neo-colonial. And in the neo-colonial din, you can't hear the whispers of people who want freedom on their own, who want freedom that kind of honors them as the people and the civilizational entity that the region is.
Thank you for that. And you were mentioning about Palestine as well. And I think in some of your recent work, you've also slipped in the question of Gaza and the similarity between Kashmir and Gaza. And would you see that as an effective solidarity? And how do you look at that sort of analogy? Because I know you've mentioned it in some of your work, I think.
So Kashmiris, for the longest possible time, the kind of solidarity that people are finding in their heart globally in the last 3-4 years for Palestine, Kashmiris have harbored that right from the get-go, because they kind of saw the resonance of Palestine with Kashmir. And I am not saying, and in my work I make it very clear, that they're not same problems, but they have similarities. They have similarities that they were born, both of them, through the classic colonialism. That's what led to these problems. And these are problems of imposition of nation state systems, which completely marauds and tramples over peoples and nations as they existed civilizationally, and kind of tries to put them inside borders, and those borders become stringent, and it's through those borders then we look at which people belong and which don't. So Kashmiris have always had solidarity with Palestine, and they've also suffered for it. I think outside Palestine and other places, Kashmir is the only place which used to go up in protests every time there was an attack from the Israeli settler state on the occupied Palestine. Anytime there was some kind of new form of assault, Kashmiris would try to go out into the street, despite the fact that going out to the street is very dangerous for Kashmiris. They will face disproportionate force all the time. And in 2016, when there was an attack on Gaza, a young 16-year-old, was it 2016 or before? I forget the date, but I've written about this. I'm sorry, I'm not recalling the year, but a young boy, 16-year-old boy, was killed. So Kashmiris have always shown that solidarity. They have always felt that solidarity, not just shown. You could see graffiti inside Kashmir where it used to say "Free Kashmir," "Free Gaza," "Save Palestine." So there's always been that education that has happened. It's an affective education. It's an affective solidarity. And what I mean by affective solidarity is that there are no outward material connections between the two places, but there is resonances of solidarity that is emotional, that is intellectual, that is also through prayer. And how when people pray Friday prayers in Kashmir, there is like a long list of places which are occupied, and Palestine is at the top of that. So there is that resonance that Kashmiris have had for the longest possible time. But very recently, after the genocide in Gaza started in 2023, Kashmiris wanted to pray for Palestine. Kashmiris wanted to do some prayers, they wanted to protest, but they were not allowed that. And one of the diktats that came out from the police was that if Kashmiris want to pray for Palestine in the mosque, like during prayers, like which are not protest at all, but you're praying inside the mosque, it should be in Arabic. You should not pray for Palestine in Kashmiri. And that kind
Yeah,
of
I was going to ask a question about that, but yeah, that
and that kind
I
of
found that very interesting.
And that kind of tells you that you want to pray for Palestine in Arabic because most people don't understand Arabic. But the moment you pray in Kashmiri, it's gonna invoke a lot of emotions that makes them not just think about Palestine and pray for them, but also think about their own situation. So you can kind of see the barriers that are the criminalization, because a police diktat is that you can't really pray in a certain way and it becomes a criminal act. Prayer becomes a criminal act. And that's where you see it's not just the criminal it's a criminalization of every way of existence. And I think it's a deep attack on human dignity and your identity as people. And that's what Kashmir is suffering at the moment. And sadly, there is also different ways of the how the government is patronizing different forms of expression, which are more aligned in making the state seem a positive entity. And that's the saddest thing that's happening right now, because that's where a majority of people are kind of paying attention world over. They're looking at the new generation of influencers who are talking about food, and everything is made cultural. So the political is being eviscerated, so to speak.
In your essay on Kashmircore, you described trying to write about Khurram Pervez, who's currently incarcerated, and finding your own archives and citations buried under algorithmic and state-driven platformized memory. And my question is, what did you find when you went looking, and how does this sort of technological shift from old school propaganda to AI-driven sort of obfuscation alter the battle over memory?
Mhm. I think it's far more insidious. It's also far more powerful because it multiplies. And it's not hidden that there are many stories that have been done in the past 6 years about how Kashmiri archives, especially in the last 30 years, what English media had covered, how they are disappearing from internet. And I saw this, I give this small vignette in that article about me not being able to locate the sources that were long-standing resources that we used, and we were not able to find them anymore. Like some of the words that we used and some of the evidence that has been proven is not there anymore because everything seems to be buried, and there is some sort of weaponization of this algorithmic assault that is happening. And also because we have to consider that in the last 6-7 years, critical analysis of Kashmir is so forbidden that we had several co-edited volumes that people would have been contributing to from Kashmir, that most of them, they retracted their articles. Because if people get government jobs in Kashmir, they do a background check on them. Obviously there is dangers not just for the job purposes, but there's dangers of writing a critical article on Kashmir. So we have had people who have retracted their articles from co-edited volumes because they're inside Kashmir and they can't write critically. So in the last 6 years, there is less and less critical analysis happening from inside Kashmir. The other thing that is also happening is that critical journalism, is also becoming very scarce. You can't really report on ground realities, and if you do, you're incarcerated. So there's a lot of repression and a lot of force that's kind of pushing people down. So what comes to the surface organically in that environment is the quote unquote the reporting that seems to put the government in positive light. And it usually concerns the army doing a medical camp somewhere, or the army going to the places that were formerly connected with places of massacres and places of mass rapes and stuff like that. So that kind of erasure is happening in this moment. That kind of assault on memory is happening in this moment. So the other thing that I also looked at was, and I have been kind of documenting and trying to figure out this disappearance of Kashmiri writing, the disappearance of Kashmiri critical writing, because I think it's very important. Early on, it was the disappearance of Kashmiri bodies, but now it's the Kashmiri writing that is under assault. So it goes deeper and deeper and deeper. The erasure has to be complete, and that's how the nation state sees it. And then there was another side to this. And the other side was to narrow state accountability in what were seen as previously big cases that are landmark cases in human rights violations that have occurred. So, for example, there is the buried evidence, which is about unmarked graves that came out in 2008. And you have unmarked, unidentified graves inside Kashmir that became a global news and put Kashmir on the map. And you have them scattered across remote regions. And there is a report that came out, it's called Buried Evidence. And it's quite a well-known report, and it has been used in United Nations reports, and rapporteurs have talked about it because it's solid evidence about this on-ground violations that have happened. Then you have another case of mass rape in Kananposhpora. There is books written about it, and activists, 5 activists, Kashmiri women activists, got together. They also wrote a book called Do You Remember Kananposhpora? So the new form of what I call Kashmircore is a new form of nuanced propaganda, which does not deny that these things happen, but they are producing similar published versions, but they're kind of narrowing state accountability. And they're also casting aspersions of what has been previously published. So this propaganda is insidious. It's more insidious. It's not brazen, but it kind of is focused on narrowing state accountability to a trickle. And it also blames Kashmiris for their own suffering. So that's kind of the new narrative that I see as Kashmircore, where you use things that are Kashmiri, also cultural things that are kind of appropriated in so many different ways to kind of prove Indian nationalism for that matter. So I thought that we had to pay attention to that kind of erasure that's happening, because a lot of people think, oh, that's human rights activism. These people are talking about Kanan Pushpara. These people are talking about unmarked graves, unidentified graves. But the fact is that they're not actually talking about them in a manner to talk about human rights violations and how to mitigate them and the political question. They're actually talking about them to minimize what they have proven, and also minimize and narrow state accountability to a not even to a trickle, even beyond that, to being non-existent, and to blame Kashmiris for their own suffering. Like, the resistance was your problem, and that's why you had so many people killed. So that kind of a thing. So that's the level of erasure we are in at this moment.
And in the same article, you sort of provide a counter memory toolkit, and it asks very little of us to bypass the glossy platforms and save the PDFs, rehost files, and practice a strict citational hygiene, treating citation as memory and
Mhm.
politics and action. What would your advice be in this current moment, for us who want to show solidarity with Kashmir and various movements that are taking place right now? What would be your recommendation to deal with Kashmircore and its sort of practices that spread elsewhere?
So we have created syllabi, we have created different resources for people. There are books, there are seminal books, and I think people should look at several of the books that have been banned very recently to read about Kashmir. And there are Resisting Disappearances in there. It's so that book is contraband in Kashmir right now. And then there is
Yeah,
another volume that is co-edited where I have also contributed as an editor. It's called Resisting Occupation. So that's also censored. So that's been banned. Sorry. So what we can ask people who want to offer solidarity is to really read Kashmiri scholars who have produced work in the last 70 years. And some of it is in Urdu, it's not translated. Some of it is in Kashmiri, that's not translated either. But there are people who are working at this moment. I know many people are writing, but they're not publishing, and many people are working on translations, but they're not publishing. So, what kind of responsibility do we have while people are under this extreme repression and erasure and they have to survive somehow? So, silence that they have to, at this moment, the silence that they're wearing is basically a survival strategy. So, in that moment, I feel because the world is digital, we really need to look at what has gone away. There are several groups that are kind of doing some archiving work in this moment. We find out who they are and we can kind of reach out to them if you want and then offer support. The same thing, archiving these PDFs that are going away. There's websites. One of the journalists, Irfan Mehraj, who is in jail currently, he had a website named Wand, meaning winter. And it was an amazing archive of different kinds of genres of writing and also reporting that's completely gone under. So then you have the resources of JKCCS, the Jammu and Kashmir Coalition of Civil Society, which is the patron organization of APDP, the Association of Parents of Disappeared Persons, one of the factions. The other one, which is under Parveena Ahangar, which she heads, they also have a website. But the JKCCS website is in this moment the archives that they have, they're languishing because Khurram Parvez is in jail. The entire organization is under siege, and there is no help for that. So, if people want to offer solidarity in terms of trying to support these archives, they can always reach out. They can reach out to many of us, and we can kind of help with recording this for posterity so that these memories don't get lost. And there are reports on the JKCCS website that that are very important for us to keep in mind what has been happening in the last 30 years actively after the 1989 armed struggle. And I don't mean to say that everything started in 1989. The 1989 is just by the way of a milestone because JKCCS was founded, I think, a decade after, and it's been heavily documenting human rights violations. It's been documenting, even it has some historical reports, and all of that needs to be saved. And all of that, you can't really see much of it in India because most of this is banned and shadow banned. People in Kashmir can't use VPNs. So these resources are not available to them. But what people can do outside is to help save these archives, reach out to journalists. There are published reports about journalists who have lost most of their work. We can help them and find ways and means of platforming those pieces that have gone away. And I also know that many of the people are self-regulating. They don't want their work to be out there in this moment because the moment your work is out there in some ways is being circulated, the next day they have a visit and they might be jailed. They might be incarcerated. We've had several journalists like that and non-journalists. There was a young man who was doing a PhD in pharmacy and he had written an article in 2010. He was in jail for a couple of years and finally he was released because they couldn't hold him for that long. So with Kashmir Lit, as I have written, many people even took down poems. We were talking about poems earlier, like what do poems say that ethnography doesn't say? We used to think that poems are a means of writing when we work under surveillance and censorship and all forms of erasure. But now people can't even write that kind of poetry. People are even asking the poetry to be deleted and not publishing the kind of poetry they want to do. So it is getting, as we say, that the river is colder than the other river.
Yeah, sending you lots of love and solidarity out there. And Your work is really inspiring. I'm now going to transition into the outro to end the conversation. Ather Zia reminds us that memory must be protected. Preserving testimony and defending archives are acts of resistance against state erasure. Solidarity with Kashmir means refusing to let those voices disappear. This is Sher Ali Khan with the Organic Filaments Network. Until next time, resist forgetting.